I'm not going to be talking about PHP at all. A lot of the talk will be covering Ruby-based tools. This is also for developers who don't have time to waste on systems administration. What I mean by that is that you're probably a freelance developer, you're working on deploying applications, blah, 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 and you have a deadline. You really don't have time to waste time installing MySQL, installing Nginx, etc. And this talk is also for any systems administrators out there who, may or may not have some automated workflow that they want to improve or implement, right? The reason why I chose to speak about this is because on a lot of the projects that I work on, I'm a freelancer. I tend to have to install servers, Nginx, MySQL, blah, blah, blah. And that's kind of annoying because every single time I install a server, I will typically miss a step. And that's probably similar for any other freelancers or system administrators who have to install their servers, etc. And I realized that as a developer, systems administration is not one of my core competencies. So rather than go through a checklist of things to do and then potentially miss something, I wanted an automated tool that would allow me to decrease the amount of time I spend on this workflow. So this talk is about being lazy. If anyone out there is not lazy and wants to make their life a lot more difficult, you can leave. Mark Story's talk is about PHP unit. Probably will also make your life a lot easier. And I'll be deploying a web server as well as an application. So in the beginning, if you are familiar with any of the stuff in education, there's stuff called Citrix, Active Directory, where you can use these are tools that you can use to deploy workstations. So typically you have a desktop appliance, you have to install OpenOffice, you have to install XYZ on it, and Citrix would allow you to do that. But for servers, there's CFEngine, and CFEngine was developed by Mark Burgess. He's at Oslo University, and he, every year as new students come in, he has to reinstall servers, desktops, workstations. And it'd be typically 100, 200 machines that he has to reinstall or install fresh from scratch. So he decided, hey, let me build a tool that's going to make a lot of these processes easier. And he built CFEngine. CFEngine kind of is like, weird Perlish syntax if you get really into it. And a lot of what CFEngine is based on is that you have these set of scripts, and as you modify those scripts, eventually all of your machines will look more or less the same. And that's a big problem because if you're automating deployments, you can't have one web server that has, Apache installed or APC, Memcache, and the other one that only has Apache installed. Right? That clearly won't work for your application. Another big problem about CFEngine is that it doesn't have many community-based packages. So if you go to a CFEngine website, it's a nice corporate website. They have very good documentation. It's very verbose, and you'll learn a lot. But it'll be hard to find packages that you can use and reuse on your own servers. So people decided, hey, this is not a tool I should be using. Let me find something else. Let me build something else. And along came Puppet Labs. Puppet Labs has a tool called Puppet. If anyone's familiar with systems administration, you'll be, hey, you're familiar with, do you work at Puppet Labs?
A lot of free beer, please.
Oh, free beer, okay. Remind me. So Puppet Labs creates a lot of tools for system administrators, and the tool that they promote the most is Puppet. And Puppet works on classes and modules. A module is a set of classes, and the classes define something, a package. So for example, MySQL would be a class. And you might say, if you're on one operating system, let me install this MySQL package. If I'm on Gentoo, let me install it from source. And a class would also have other utilities, such as let me start the service after everything's been compiled. Let me ensure that these files are in place. Let me automatically template out the my.cnf for MySQL. Right? Puppet also gives you a nice, concise wiki with modules. So if you have any tool that you need to install, Nginx, if you need to install some service on your server, then Puppet probably has that as a module out there. So if you want to go to forge.puppetlabs.com, that would basically be your CakeForge that was still installed. Personally, I don't like Puppet because, well, it's built in Ruby, but the syntax isn't Ruby-ish. So not only do I have to learn a new language, but I also have to learn a very specific DSL. That's not one of my favorite things to do. And that was one of the reasons I chose skip CFEngine, because I would have to learn the new language for CFEngine, plus its weird syntax, etc. So I skipped Puppet. We can do better, obviously. Otherwise, my talk would be over. So I picked Chef. Chef is a nice, awesome package. It's written in Ruby. It has a really, really clean DSL in Ruby. And just if you're at all familiar with Ruby, or if you can even program, you'll be able to understand Chef. Chef works with cookbooks, where a cookbook is a set of instructions for installing some software. So if you have, let's say, hot proxy, and you have some templates, you have some definitions, etc., a cookbook comprises of that, and it is the hot proxy cookbook. And then, of course, you'll be installing multiple cookbooks on the server. Right? If you're in the Rails community at all, you'll be familiar with Chef, because people will just be talking about it, etc. And the documentation for Chef is a lot better, I think, than CFEngines or Puppets. So this is definitely a tool to check out. Right? So like I said, each deployment, when you're deploying a server, let's say you're deploying a web application that has cake packages. Cake packages depends on MySQL, depends on Nginx, depends on APC. The set of cookbooks for that would comprise those cookbooks, each one of those, and each one of them may or may not depend on another. So for example, I might have a cookbook that installs cake packages, the actual web application. That would depend on PHP being installed, so I can specify that dependency. It also depends on having some template for the Nginx configuration, and it depends on having APC installed. That way cake packages don't fall over when people browse to it. Recipes are part of your cookbook. Right? So a recipe in a cookbook can be as simple as installing a PHP module, right? Or it can be as complex as installing several different web applications on your machine. Of course, let's get into what a recipe is made of. Recipes are made of resource calls, and a resource call is where you install a particular, it's a set of instructions, and it can be as simple as installing a web application from Git, right? So here's my resource call to Git, and I'm installing in that repository, in that directory, a given repository under these users, right? Every resource has a name, and here you can see that the name is very, very unique. And the name, in a lot of cases, if you're installing multiple applications using the same recipe, you'll need to sort of namespace whatever you call the resource. Otherwise, when Chef runs, it'll try to reinstall the same thing over and over and over. So you'll notice I specify the node directory as well as the name of the resource, host name, and the base, where base would be default or your subdomain. Hostname would be cakepackages.com. And then this node server production directory, that's actually something that comes out of a DNA JSON I'll be talking about. Of course, every resource is named by something. There's Git, and there are other resources as well. If you're installing a package on the actual machine, it would be called a Debian package or whatever it is. There are resources to template out files. There are resources to start services, etc. Right? And every resource is given a set of options, which you specify inside of the resource block. Right? So you can, of course, make your own resources. And resources are made up, or definitions are made up of other resource calls. So you'll see right here, I'm actually creating a resource that will create an Nginx configuration. And what it'll do is it'll create an Nginx conf file with, using that source for the HTML file, and pass it some variables that I might specify as parameters to this call. Right? And then once I want to use this resource, all I have to do is include the definition in my Nginx, or in my recipe, and then call Nginx up, which is by the definition name. Pass some variables, give it a name, and it goes to town. All right, so it's very, very easy to customize resources for your given application. So for example, for cake packages, when I want to bring up a new instance, I have a set of resources that will automatically install APC, etc., based on something specific within the cake packages directory. Right? So I might clone cake packages. I have a config/resources file, and it'll automatically see, oh, here's the configuration for this application. Let me make sure I install everything for it. Right? And of course, these aren't real resources. If you want to look at real resources, you want to look into providers. Chef providers are a little bit more complex, so that's why I didn't showcase them. But this is a very, very easy way of defining something very custom for your application, right? So if we wanted to bring up a new site, bringing up a new site is just, a bit of Ruby syntax around resources. You'll notice I have in my nodes are defined in DNA JSON. I have a set of static applications where I have a host name and then the site configuration, or the sites. And each site has a configuration where I iterate over every single configuration to make sure everything's installed. So I'll set up the directory, I'll install the application using Git, and then I'll bring up the application using Nginx up. Right? So it's very, very trivial to install your application on a web server using Chef. Right? And Chef will typically take this template, which, as you see, gets passed some variables, and turn it into this. Right? That site is live, it's working, it's all based on what Chef generates for me. And it's pretty simple to tell Chef, hey, add these variables to this position to make sure that this website runs in a different way than every other static website. Right? So now demo time. So if you notice, CakePackages.com should be down. Right? And if anyone tries to browse to CakePackages.com, you'll obviously be getting the actual live site. I bought up a new linode instance, which completely fresh, there's nothing installed. In fact, I just booted it. So I'll call fab all. Fab is a command in Fabric. Fabric's a Python deployment tool, and I'm simply using it to send commands to the server. Ooh. Demo. Mate. Don't say. All right. So, command Fabric. Fabric will send commands to the server, update the server, make sure all the packages are set, sync my Chef scripts, and then run everything. Of course, if I had internet, that would work. Great. So, just show you what an actual DNA file looks like. So, Fabric executes a couple commands. Let's see if I can show that off. There you go. Basically, I just call fab all, which calls setup. Setup installs Ruby, make sure my SSH keys are up, make sure the site's working, etc. Then I sync the files, sync the configuration, and run Chef. Once Chef runs, it runs across a DNA JSON file, which you can manually specify, and you'll notice I specify a couple recipes to use. So I specify a couple recipes to use, and it'll go through and install every single recipe. And you'll notice I also specify some users to add to the server. Specify an Apache configuration. Specify a MySQL configuration. That's actually my regular password, so please don't log into my email right now. And then of course I specify applications to install. Here you see I have some static applications based on exactly that recipe I showed you earlier, and it just goes through and installs each and every single one of those applications for me. All right. And then of course I have some CakePHP applications, which I give it some configuration, and it'll go through programmatically install every single one of these. All right. And a lot of this is very site specific. So you'll notice I have a WordPress configuration for Cake Packages. If you went to CakePackages.com/blog and this new configuration, it would have a WordPress install with all of that information in there. Right. And then of course you can also set up Chef to have staging and production environments, as I did. Right. So a lot of this is very, very specific to how I set up. All right. So I'll get back to my talk. So, like I said, server DNA is set up for a specific instance of your server. So you might have MySQL, and you might have your database server. Your database server DNA JSON would have a MySQL recipe in there. It might have Redis, it might have a Mongo recipe or a cookbook, and it might have some configuration for all of that. Right? You don't necessarily have to give every single server Apache or MySQL, etc. Just in my case, I wanted to. Right? DNA JSON references both recipes and configurations. So you'll notice that at the top of my DNA JSON, I had a set of recipes I wanted to install on the server, and then right under that had all of the configuration for that server. That includes users that I want to have on the server, groups, any extra configuration for the recipes that I have, etc. So, and then another thing about DNA JSON is that when you modify the DNA JSON, it'll automatically go through and make sure everything on the server is exactly as you specified in that DNA. So if you said, hey, I don't want Apache installed anymore, you might remove the Apache recipe and you'd remove the Apache configuration, add Nginx or whatever. Chef would go through and uninstall Apache. It would make sure Nginx is properly configured. And one of the cool things about Chef is that it'll complain whenever it can't do something, right? So if you, for example, had Apache still running and you tried to install Nginx, Nginx is going to want to share that port. And then Chef will say, hey, I can't install Nginx. I'm not going to continue. Please fix this, right? And then obviously, because the DNA is very, very specific to your server, you can have multiple DNA JSON, and you can have one very specific for your application. So you don't necessarily have to install a lot of applications on a given server. You can say this one application should have this one DNA JSON, or this one application should have several DNA JSON, one for your load balancer, one for your MySQL database, one for your web servers, one for your backup, etc. Right. So what about Cake? I actually went through and I built a set of cookbooks. If you go to that nice short URL, I'll bring you to a GitHub repository where you can clone my cookbooks, and I'll be shortly adding the DNA JSON that you can use with instructions. And basically, it's just a set of cookbooks that I think everyone's going to want to install on their servers. If you're a freelancer, it'll have Nginx configured properly, you'll have redirects, it'll have compression, etc. And the nice thing about DNA and your set of cookbooks is that when you share them, you can continuously work on them and also say, hey, I found this nice enhancement that I can perform on Nginx, do you want it, etc. And as you're working on your application, you might realize, hey, in the future, I'll want XYZ installed on the server. So you add that to your recipes, you add that to your DNA JSON, you continuously just run Chef update, and Chef will go to town, install all the applications that you need, install all the resources, etc. Right? So this is the part where I would have went back, hey, my application's running, but unfortunately it's not, so continue. So what about the application? If you've updated your server and you've deployed everything, great, that's fantastic. You still need to update your application whenever you're working on it. If anyone builds an application and just finishes, deploys, and walks away, that's great. But personally, as a freelancer, I'm continuously working on something, or every once in a while a client will say, hey, something's not working, please update the app, add this feature. So if you're deploying your application, you can use Bash. At SeatGeek, we actually used a custom Bash script, which would go onto SSH onto the box, pull all the changes, set up some files, make sure temp directory and log directory is writable, and then that would be that. We had some code to handle different environments, which is great and all, but it was error prone, right? And of course, Bash isn't written for, it's not meant for this. So if you don't know any Bash, it's not going to really help you, right? There's a tool called Capistrano. It's built in CakePHP 1.2, I believe, and you're welcome to use it. But as far as I'm concerned, it's been not updated in the past 3 years, so probably not what you're looking for. And it also doesn't have support for Git or Subversion, I believe. So a lot of you who are using Git, Perforce, etc., won't really help you. You can use Fing, and you can use XML, but probably don't want that. You can use Ant as well, but you'll probably hurt yourself. So as the slide mentions, there are a lot of deployment tools out there: Fing, Capistrano, Ant. If you're familiar with Vlad the Deployer, that's another tool in Ruby. And there's Sparkle, for example, which is also in Ruby. And this is great, but a lot of them aren't very full-featured. So I came across Capistrano. Capistrano is, again, another Ruby tool. And if you've ever read Mark's blog, he actually goes through the process of configuring Capistrano for a CakePHP application. A lot of the stuff that's in Capistrano is very similar to Chef, where you can have specific sets of instructions for a given thing that you want to perform. So for example, if you want to clear your cache, Capistrano will allow you to specify, here's the clear cache method, right? And Capistrano also has a set of instructions that are default to whatever the deployment strategy you're going to perform. So if you're using Git to deploy, there's the deploy namespace, and the deploy namespace has a default method. The default method actually deploys all your code. There's a migrate method on deploy, which will run migrations. And a lot of this is Ruby specific, but you're able to override it for CakePHP or for any other framework and define what you're going to perform on this method. All right. So if you want to install Capistrano, very simple. Make sure you have Ruby gems installed. Gem install Capistrano. Capistrano also has some extensions if you want to look into those. There's Capistrano Multi-X. There's a Murder, which is a tool created by Twitter, which deploys across BitTorrent. So once you have Capistrano installed, you cd into whatever directory it is that you're going to deploy, usually the app folder, and you type Capfile dot. Capfile dot, the dot is important because that'll Capify the current directory, not some other directory, and if you miss this dot, it'll complain. It won't do anything. So just remember the dot or the full path to the directory you're in. All right. So again, Capfile dot creates a cap file. The cap file simply includes the config/deploy RB and any vendors, plugins, etc. that you might have in your application. And including config/deploy RB is just a convention from Rails. A lot of the configuration is in the config folder, and a lot of the configuration in CakePHP is also in the config folder, so it still makes sense to move that there. If you don't want that extra file, you feel free to move everything from your deploy.rb to your cap file. Everything will work just fine. So yeah, and again, the cap file loads up plugins from the plugins directory and from the vendors directory. These are both conventions in Rails, but they map really well to CakePHP. So if you want to have some vendors for Capistrano, feel free to add them. Right. So your deploy RB. When you initially type Capify dot, this is what's going to occur on your application or in your deploy RB. So you'll have a set of variables that you can set. In Capistrano, when you want to set a variable for the deploy, you do set and then the symbol that you're going to use for the variable, and then after a comma, whatever the variable is set to. So for example, set application CakePackages.com, and that would be a string, right? And then of course you can have multiple roles in your application. So how Chef, you would have multiple DNA JSON, one for your database, one for your web servers, one for your load balancer. You can do similar here, where you would have a role for your load balancer, a role for your web server, a role for your database. Capistrano also has a couple neat extensions that you can use for defining primary and secondary roles. Here, this is the default, where it says we have a primary database server and we have a slave database server. It's really easy to set up, migrations where you would run it on the primary, and the secondary, the slave, is read-only, so you don't have to run the migrations there. And you can also define multiple different types of web servers. Let's say you have one web server that is Apache-based, and the Nginx web server proxies all of the PHP traffic to that. It's pretty simple to set that up. Right. Another thing about Capistrano is that it supports multiple types of source control. So for example, default is actually Subversion. A lot of you may still be on Subversion applications, and that's great. If you want to use Git, feel free to. If you want to use anything else, that's also fine. If you're not using version control, you can also use FTP, and that's great too. There's a couple instructions and a little bit of configuration that you'll need to perform, but Capistrano basically takes care of you. Right. Again, you can specify your own deployment tools. So in Cake Packages, I actually have a namespace that does all my migrations. It uses the CakeDC migrations plugin, and it runs migrations. It makes sure that I can get the status. It makes sure I can bring down a migration, etc. And it's really simple to override core functionality. You just define the namespace, define the task that you want to override, and that's that. And of course, you can add your own. So for example, you can do environment handling. This is custom code. This is, it won't be in the base deploy.rb configuration. And you'll see right here that I'm getting some variables from some configuration hash and setting them to whatever the environment is. And I have two environments, staging, production. Whenever I want to run a task on production or whenever I want to run a task on staging, all I have to do is cap staging and then whatever namespace and task I want to perform. So when I want to deploy staging, cap staging deploy. When I want to deploy production, cap production deploy. And obviously you can say if the current environment isn't production, don't run this set of tasks. So in staging, I probably wouldn't want to run the migrations automatically. in production, I probably wouldn't want to clear a PC automatically. So you can do a lot with this. And of course, in staging, I would want to be able to deploy any branch that I prefer. But in production, I would only want to deploy master. Obviously, you can change these defaults. Right. So again, like I said, you can create custom tasks. Here I have a task for Asset Compress, which is a plugin by Mark Story. And Asset Compress will minify your assets, make sure everything's working fine. And as you'll notice, I've created custom namespace, the asset namespace, and 4 custom tasks for it. So when I want to run this in Cake Packages, all I have to do is cap staging asset : rebuild, and that'll rebuild my assets. You can do more fancy things than just simply run commands. You can actually capture commands if you wanted to. You can SSH onto other boxes, etc. It's really up to you. If you need to symlink files, all of that's available to you. And actually, Capistrano gives you a couple utilities to perform some methods. If you want, you can go on the Capistrano wiki for that. Right. So again, running this cap prod asset : rebuild. Right. So there's some caveats. When you're deploying with Capistrano, they have a specific directory structure where you have the deploy folder, which actually has your application that you're deploying, but per convention, it's the public directory, and you can change it to whatever you want. But because of the way in which it does older versions, those older versions are in a releases folder, and the public folder is symlinked. So if you are doing by the default stuff, you're going to have to either copy over the Cake core into the releases folder, or you're going to have to specify where the application is currently held, right? So use the app flag. It takes a little bit of initial setup, and if your application isn't set up for Capistrano and the way it works, you might have a little bit of trouble. So for example, if you're using FTP and a remote cache, and you're constantly just updating your files, you're going to have to specify, hey, here's how my releases directory is set up. If you don't want a releases directory, etc. And if you don't want a shared directory, the shared directory, you can put various things, your temporary cache, whatever, then you're going to have to configure that. If there's multiple people deploying, that's going to be a bit of a drag because Capistrano just runs some commands. It doesn't check to see if anyone else is deploying. There are tools around it that are built for this. So if you're using Webistrano, that's a Ruby tool, and I believe it's in Sinatra. You can log in, click the deploy button, and it will deploy according to your Capistrano setup. But if there are multiple developers in different areas, then you might want to say, hey guys, I'm deploying. Another caveat is that it won't work very well with large files and large deploys. So if you have a lot of binary files in your application, if you have versioned in web images, a bunch of images, that's going to be a time suck, right? So a cool thing about Capistrano is it has a remote cache where it'll just copy in an existing deploy, update that deploy, and then symlink that over. So you probably want to look into that if you have a large repository. In SeatGeek's case, we actually have a bunch of images that are versioned and they can constantly update. So whenever we want to deploy those images, that deploy might take 10 minutes, right? So just be aware. There are tools, and yeah, there's another caveat, whereas if you're deploying to hundreds of servers, this could kill GitHub, right? Every single server will be constantly pulling from GitHub saying, hey, give me the latest version, give me the latest version, give me the latest version. If you have 1,000 servers, it's not going to fly, right? So there's actually a tool called Murder, which will deploy across BitTorrent. And so keep that in mind. If you have 1 or 2 applications that you have to update, great. It works 6, it's great. But if you have thousands of web servers and you're hitting one instance for your repository, it's going to take forever or it's going to fail somehow, right? So be aware, it's running everything sort of in parallel, right? So that's the end of my talk, I guess. You can clap, you can go. Of course, I got some links, not CFEngine, because I'm not going to give you that. That's not good. Any questions?
Do you use deploy keys on GitHub? Do you use them with like custom tasks or anything with Capistrano?
For Capistrano, what I usually do if it's a new repository, if it's a new server and I'm bringing up an entirely new thing, it depends on whether or not it's an application I'm working on or if it's something that's pre-existing. If it's pre-existing and the company has a GitHub account, I'll use the deploy keys. Otherwise, I'll set up a new user or I'll add a deploy key specifically for them. I'll use that. And then, of course, just run Capistrano. I'll have to set it up, obviously.
Okay.
Any other questions? Cool. Yeah. If that had worked, I would have been able to show you cake packages installed on a brand new web server running Nginx. Fortunately, it did not. So I'll go over a little bit about how Chef works. Right. So you'll notice I have a Cookbooks directory, and I have an uploads directory. This uploads directory is actually something that I use internally for my own applications, and in there I have a SQL directory, and then I have a set of SQL that I want to run on the server. Right. That's actually all maintained in my sites. Right. So every single cookbook can be made out of attributes, can be made out of recipes, templates, definitions, and a lot of it is very single serving, where you'll say this recipe doesn't need an attribute, doesn't need templates, it just needs to run some commands. And you can have multiple recipes in your cookbook. Right? So you'll notice right here I have an Apache recipe and I have an Nginx recipe. I also have something to import MySQL. A lot of that stuff can be custom. And in the PHP cookbook, I have different recipes. Something to install modules, MongoDB if I want to install Memcache, etc. And I also have recipes to install PHP using fastCGI, install PHP using just regular commands. So if we go back to the sites, if we go to Nginx Cake, you notice I can set up using just regular Ruby some variables for creating files later. And a lot of this stuff is very, very custom, very unique to how I deploy, where I'll have an apps folder, and an apps folder will have different environments, staging and production, and then I'll have the actual applications in there. Right. So it's pretty easy to actually create a new recipe. You just define a recipe is just a set of resources that you call in a specific way. And like I said before, one of the big things that you'll stumble over immediately is that every single recipe has a unique name. And if you don't name them uniquely, it could overwrite the previous one because of the way in which Chef runs over your recipes. It'll have a compile step in which it'll take all this Ruby code and turn it into a bunch of actual shell commands, right? So obviously it doesn't run directory blah, right? It says mkdir and then your directory, right? So it's pretty important to specify your resources in a unique way. Otherwise, you're going to come up with some weird configuration where you might not actually install that last application. You might only install the first one several times, right? So yeah, and you'll notice right here, I create a directory, I iterate and create all my shared directories that I need to create, and then continue going. Chef actually has a couple different types of resources. One of the more useful ones will be execute. If you're running very, very custom code and the resources aren't in Chef proper, you're going to have to use the execute command, where execute will run any custom script that you want to run, any command. So yeah, you'll notice right here that I make sure that my directories are chmoded properly, etc. Right. For actual version control systems, if you want to use Subversion, there is a SVN command, there's a git command, and there are a couple other version control commands. They're all just a generic implementation of a Chef provider. Where I mentioned Chef providers are definitions, or they're resources rather, or generic resources. Git is an implementation of the SCM provider, and it does something very specific. It does git pull, whatever, blah, blah, blah. Subversion might do something different. So SVN up, and Perforce might do something different as well. But each of these has a common API for accessing them. So you don't necessarily have to use Git. You can use Subversion if you needed to. Right. So again, it's all very basic Ruby. If you know anything about Ruby, you see that we can define custom variables in the actual resource names. We can define custom variables for the actual configuration. One of the interesting things about resources in Chef is that each resource can have multiple different types of actions. Or you might say, here's the Git repository, here's the Git command resource. Let me make sure that my Git resource or my application stays up to date. Let me pull or merge, or let me just make sure that the Git copy is there existing, right? So you have two different commands, one of which is clone and one of which is checkout. Checkout would obviously be update your repository. Clone would just bring it down, and that would be that, right? So yeah, there's a way in which you can specify templates as well. So a template would be like your database.php. Typically you'll have on one machine, it'll have certain connection strings for one database. Maybe you have one application where whenever someone's writing, it goes to that application, but whenever someone's reading, it goes to a different one. With templates, you can specify your database PHP in a generic way and then just pass variables using your DNA JSON. And so in my CakePHP Nginx configuration, I actually have a template for specifying database.php. Right, so you'll notice here, I have a database PHP, I have a bootstrap PHP, and I have a core PHP file. The templates are actually ERB files, which is eRubis templating. It's pretty simple, nothing very complex. You just open a PHP or Ruby tag, have your variable there, close it, and that's that. Right, and then of course, because it's a Ruby template file, you can actually use any series of if statements, complex switch, whatever, if you need to. And so you notice here, my bootstrap file doesn't have anything. You don't need to pass variables into your templates, right? And then of course you have attributes. An attribute can be as simple as setting as default, right? Or it can be as complex as introspecting on your DNA JSON file to figure out what variables it needs to set, right? So yeah, that's about it.